Our scripture reading for today comes from Luke chapter 12.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" He said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I'll do this. I will pull down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And these things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." This is the word of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So last week, we talked about how one of the ways that you could get to know what a teacher was about, what a rabbi was about, was you could ask that rabbi how it is they prayed, and ask them to teach you how to pray. And as you heard their prayer, you would learn what was on their heart, how they related to God, and how they asked God to shape them and mold them to be a person in the world. That was one thing that rabbis commonly did. The other thing that was commonly there for a rabbi to do was to be an arbitrator, to be an interpreter of the law. Be the person who you could come to if you ended up in some sort of conflict between either a family member or a neighbor. And it was then the rabbi's job to sort of help sort out these low-level disputes. Something a bit like a community elder crossed with a small claims court. And so one day a man comes to Jesus. We figure he was probably a younger brother. And he says, "Tell my brother to share with me, to divide with me, to give me a portion of my father's estate." And Jesus doesn't seem to be interested in doing that work at all. Jesus doesn't seem to be interested in wading into that family squabble at all. Instead, he uses this as an opportunity to teach, presumably that guy, but also his disciples who are there with him, what it means to live in the world as a person who is generous, and how we are to treat the good things that God gives to us in our lives. And Jesus tells this parable, and it ends really roughly, right? This guy dies abruptly, and Jesus wraps it up by saying, "And so it is with people who are not generous to God." And it can make it sound, if you're not careful, like God is exacting some sort of vengeance on this guy for not being generous. That when he got this influx of crops, that building bigger barns was essentially a death sentence to him. But if you read the passage carefully, I don't think that's what it's saying. Okay? It seems instead that what's going on here is that Jesus is reminding us that all these good things that God gives us are not just for our benefit, and that when God gives us more than what we need, it's not for us to just sock away for a rainy day. And here's why I think that. Because if you were just reading through this passage in Luke, you would have read last week's reading and then this one. So you'd have Jesus there teaching his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." And as he does that, he's not just telling them that God is the one who provides for us. He's hearkening all the way back to the days when the people of Israel were wandering in the desert. In those days, God literally provided daily bread for the people. It came to them in the form of manna. They would get up every morning, go out and collect this fine, flaky, bread-like substance, and there would be enough there for them to have for the day. And anything that was left over at the end of the day rotted. Which meant that they were going to have to trust that the next day, when they got up, that God was going to provide them what they needed. This was God teaching the people of Israel what it was like to be in a trusting relationship. To rely not on their own strength or their own smarts or their own savvy or the ability of themselves to provide for themselves, but to trust that God would give them what they needed to get through. And what Jesus seems to be saying in this parable is that if you come to a place in life where you find that you have more than you need, the thing that you are to do is not necessarily to build a bigger barn to store it all, but to find a way to share it, to build a bigger table. Because it might very well be that the excess that's come into your life is actually designed to be shared with somebody else. Because God has designed us to be interdependent on one another. So that when the day comes when you find yourself in need, you can reach out to your neighbor and trust that they'll take care of you. And similarly, your neighbor can trust that on the days when they're in need, they can come to you. That's part of what it means to have daily bread. Now, all of that is hard for us today. Because, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, they always taught me the story of the ants and the grasshopper. And the grasshopper spends the whole summer frolicking and doing whatever and not preparing for the winter. And the ants diligently prepare for the winter. And then winter comes and there's not enough food and the ants close the door. They have what they need and the grasshopper's left on the outside hungry. Our culture values the self-made man or woman. The one who can look around and say, I don't need anybody. I can just rely on myself. But I don't think that's the gospel message. I don't think that's the message that Jesus is teaching his disciples, and I don't think that's the message that he's teaching to us. The thing that Jesus is saying here is that we're designed for community. Designed to rely on each other, to provide for one another. And sometimes that's the way God ends up providing daily bread for us. Now, this week, my wife and I had a conversation that I think lots of people had a variation on this conversation. The conversation was, what would we do if we won that lotto? Right? They were speculating between Tuesday and Friday that it was going to be $1 billion. I saw on the news earlier today that the winners are supposed to get $1.2 billion. And it got me thinking a little bit about just how much $1 billion of anything actually is. I don't know that we get our heads around that number real well. $1 million, maybe we can start to understand. So, if you wanted to guess, how long ago is 1,000,000 seconds ago? If you started right now and counted backwards 1,000,000 seconds, when would you land? Anyone want to guess? Last Monday. Last Monday is 1,000,000 seconds ago. You want to guess how long ago 1,000,000,000 seconds is?
Maybe 5,000 days.
Be 1,000 times more than that. 31 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or maybe you're a visual learner. This is my handy dandy 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. You probably can't make out the characters that are printed on it, but there are asterisks on it. The little star that you get by pressing Shift 8. There are 4,000 of them on this piece of paper. If I wasted 2 reams of the church's copy paper by printing out that page 500 times, I would have 40,000 little asterisks. And if I stack these reams of paper up, starting right there, and made a line that way, when I got to 1,000,000,000 asterisks, I'd be just on the other side of the far wall. 1,000,000,000 is a big number. 1,000,000,000 is a huge number. 1,000,000,000 is build a bigger barn number. Or maybe it's build a bigger table number. This week, in fact, just earlier today, some of us were engaged in the work of building a bigger table. Together with our friends at Gleaners and at Kroger, we had a food drive for 4 hours. And over the course of 4 hours, we collected about 4 carloads worth of food. And that food is going to be daily bread for people in our community who desperately need it. You may not be surprised to know that our food pantry has bloomed. It's getting more and more use as people find out that this is a place where they can come to and get their needs met. As they find out that this place, staffed by people of faith, is a place where daily bread is freely available. And here's the amazing thing. Early on, the earliest expressions of the Christian church, when they gathered for communion, they didn't do communion the way we do communion. They didn't have a little round wafer and a little sip of juice. Instead, what they did was they threw a potluck. Everyone would go to the biggest house that they could find, the house usually of the richest person in the community. And there, everybody brought food. And as a part of that, they made sure everybody had enough food to eat. So that communion table wasn't just about bread and wine, about you and Jesus alone for a moment. That table was a very real way in which people had their daily needs met. It was a way that daily bread made it from the hands of people who had it to the people who needed it. So, today, we're going to do communion a little bit differently. You may notice we don't have a communion table here. We got no communion on our normal altar. Today, communion is going to be out in the narthex. On that table that's loaded down with food that we collected from the food drive. The other thing you'll find there are some rolls that I bought at the store today, some grape juice that I bought at the store today, some grapes that I bought at the store today. Together, we're going to have a meal. Probably not a full meal, but still more than just a wafer and a little sip of juice. Because we're going to enact together, over time, this very real way of making sure that our neighbors have daily bread, of living out this parable that Jesus taught his disciples. We're going to do that same thing. We're not just going to build bigger barns. We're going to build a bigger table and use it to care for people in need and testify to a God who provides abundantly for you, for me, for this entire hurting world. So, let's pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you that you've provided enough for us. Maybe not for all of the wants in the world, but definitely for all of our needs. Teach us to be generous with each other as you've been generous with us. To share with others that all would have daily bread.